If you're even passingly familiar with anime meme culture, you know exactly who this is. Bandit Keith Howard is, in his own way, one of the most recognizable Yu-Gi-Oh! Characters of all time. A huge part of that is the result of the Abridged series, poking fun at him and his American flag bandana.
Oi boss, you know we're not actually in America, right? I don't understand a word you just said. Try speaking American, it's the only language I understand.
Even if you've never personally watched Yu-Gi-Oh!, you've definitely at least seen gifs of this guy around social media, usually related to something American. Online, he is the anime representative of what everyone outside of the US sees Americans as. But if you look at the actual source material, manga or anime, there's actually a lot more to Keith than meets the eye. He is shockingly nuanced for a character of his archetype, and while the original story never quite hit the mark with him in terms of narrative purpose, the manga spin-off absolutely solidified Keith as genuinely deep and tragic with one single powerful moment.
And I've spent over a decade of my life overthinking every minute detail of this character's story, and I'm about to make it your problem. So join me, won't you, as we overanalyze the anime American, the only one you'll ever need to know, Bandit Keith.
This duel doesn't count! Nobody makes a monkey out of me!
To start with, I'm going to sum up everything that happens involving Keith throughout the main story of Yu-Gi-Oh!
We first meet Keith during the Duelist Kingdom arc, in a flashback told by Seto Kaiba. In the dub, it's the Intercontinental Championships. In the original manga, it was just like a challenge that Keith sent Pegasus, and Pegasus decided to roll with. Keith is stated to be one of the best duelists in the game, a card professor. His nickname as Bandit Keith is based on how he swoops into every tournament and snatches up the prize money with ease. Keith has this impressive, lofty reputation, only for Pegasus and his mind-reading abilities to utterly steamroll him. But rather than just beat him, he brings over a random child to duel on his behalf, with instructions on a piece of paper on how to defeat Keith. This humiliation led to Kaiba's understanding that Pegasus is a cheating magical bitch face, but more importantly for this video is the setup for when Keith enters the story properly. He shows up the very next episode lugging a trio of randos: Ghost Kotsuzuka, Bones, Takaido, Sid, and Satake, Zygor. Kotsuzuka is the only one of these three who really matters to the story, but it's also interesting to note that he's the youngest of these three guys. Keith's plan for them, in the manga and anime, is to use them as proxies to sweep up enough star chips to get into Pegasus' castle, which we learn later he basically already did, because Takaido and Satake already have 5 chips each. Still, bear that in mind for later. We see the trio hunting for duelists to challenge, and they happen upon the main cast. They recognize Yugi Moto, so they report to Keith. I should note as well that Keith, in the sub and the manga, claims to have never heard of Yugi when his gang mentions that he was one of the duelists they saw. And while he could be telling the truth, after all, he is an American, and therefore isn't necessarily tuned into Duel Monsters news in Japan, it's equally likely that he's lying here as an excuse to brush Yugi off. In the dub, he says he does know who Yugi is, and points out that Yugi's only strong according to his reputation. Keith, upon being told that there was a second duelist, Katsuya Jonochi, decides that he's the easier target, and they proceed to kidnap him into a cave. In the anime, they knock him out to do this. In the manga, they haul Jonochi, kicking and struggling, and oh my god, Kotsuzuka sweetie, your feet aren't even touching the ground, how are you so tiny? Oh, speaking of which, the anime also adds a scene of Keith and Kotsuzuka preparing for the duel, since he's no longer with the other two to do some teenager abduction. This scene is more interesting for Kotsuzuka's characterization than Keith's, but on Keith's end, it does give a strong sense of how much his gang relies on him and trusts him. Whether he plays along with it or is openly contemptuous of them depends on which version of the anime you're watching. In the original, Keith kind of accidentally underestimates how easily he can push over this absolutely small human being when he goes to encourage him. In the dub, it's an intentional threat for Bones to do as he says.
You better not, or you're gonna find yourself in a world of hurt. You wouldn't want that now, would you?
Skipping ahead to the duel, Keith is backseat dueling the entire time. And at this moment, I would like to pause and note that rewatching this anime is a genuine chore when it's not like a TV broadcast I'm tuning into every week. If you try to binge this show, you will find that the Duel Monsters anime is the most tedious, horrendously paced anime from your childhood or mine, and that's only partly because of the studio trying to stay behind the manga. In most duels of this show, if one of the participating duelists so much as breathes air, at least 40 people have to comment on it. And while that's pretty normal for most shonen anime, most shonen that do this are at least battle shonen, where the action involved is some impressive, hard-hitting animation work that hopefully benefits from the pauses in between, so that the audience can register what they just saw. But well, we're just watching some dudes play card games. Even with the holographic monsters doing battle, that it's not exciting enough to warrant 10 minutes of yapping in between things actually happening. Gratefully, the duel between Jonochi and Kotsuzuka is mostly devoid of that. Because Keith and his gang kidnapped him away from his friends, the rest of the main cast is out looking for Jonochi, and the duel itself is just the 5 of them until towards the end. What's more, because the only spectators for most of the duel are the bad guys, there's less concern about what they think of the situation at hand, and therefore more focus on Jonochi and Kotsuzuka's internal monologue, which is a type of commentary that's actually valuable in this circumstance, given Duel Monsters' heavy focus on strategy. This duel is the first time we get a sense of Keith's personal knowledge of the game. Now that he has every kind of deck for every kind of opponent, even if we don't see the one he personally favors until the finals. He knows Kotsuzuka's deck better than Kotsuzuka himself does, and that's only partly because of the modifications he made to it. Note Kotsuzuka's reaction when he draws Call of the Living Dead.
そうか、兄貴はこのカードで逆転を狙っていたのか。
Implying that he knew about this card because it was a card he already used, but didn't realize it was the card Keith was banking on. Throughout the duel, we also see that he knows of Jonochi's best 2 cards, Time Magician and Red Eye's Black Dragon, when he sees them. He's the one to explain Time Magician's effect to Kotsuzuka, and is shocked that Jonochi has a card like Red Eyes when he plays it. Keith is mostly relaxed for most of this duel, and is mostly, seemingly, supportive of Kotsuzuka up until the moment Jonochi plays shield in right hand, sword in left hand. Rather than admit that the unstoppable strategy that he walked Kotsuzuka through was, in fact, entirely stoppable, Keith puts the blame for the loss on Kotsuzuka and leaves the cave, his gang lugging disappointedly behind him. Afterwards, Keith has them trap the main characters in the cave with a boulder which somehow 3 guys, one of which being a skinny noodle and the other being a baby-sized teenager with no mass whatsoever, are able to move but 5 fit, healthy teenagers cannot? It's not even like they're pushing it downhill, at least not to any significant extent. How freaking yoked is Satake? Anyway, he does this and then he turns around and beats the shit out of Kotsuzuka. We at least don't see the damage when Keith does this in the anime. All the beating is off screen, in both versions of the episode. But in the manga, he is brutal to poor Kotsuzuka. We see a lot more of it. And he caps it all off by telling this child, who ultimately chose to trust him wholeheartedly, even when he felt he shouldn't have, to go die.
Kotsuzuka's my baby, by the way. I feel so bad for him.
Keith beats up Tokaido and Satake too, but not before yoinking Satake's dueling glove and all their star chips. Ultimately, he always saw these 3 as disposable if need be, and it's probably his most primary character-defining moment, more so than anything else he does. After this, we don't see Keith again until the kids are about to get into Pegasus's castle. He floats around in the background for a while, watching other people duel and occasionally getting some bullying in, until he finally has something to do the night before the Duelist Kingdom finals. In that episode, he finds out all the duelists need to have at least one of 2 cards that were included in the invitation package. One that allows for dueling Pegasus, the other that offers the prize money. Keith, having piggybacked off his gang up until now, doesn't have either one. But Yuki gives Jonochi the prize money card, and Keith has an idea.
Well, time to catch some Z's.
Don't snore too loud.
I don't snore.
That night, Keith sneaks into Jonochi's room and steals the card. In the manga, this scene also includes some stuff about Keith getting caught and getting his ass beat, but still getting away with the card. And honestly, I prefer the anime where he just takes the card and sneaks off. I'll explain this preference later. Anyway, this blatant cheatery lands Keith safely in the finals, but does not prevent Jonochi from finding another card, courtesy of Mai, and dueling him. This duel is, of course, where we finally get a full look at the scope of Keith's abilities, both legitimate and illegal. He's a high-reward duelist, with the high-risk half of that equation nullified by machine monsters being overpowered apparently, and more importantly, the fact that Keith quite literally has the cards he needs up his sleeve. Wristband. Pegasus also takes the time to read the minds of both duelists during this bout. Jonochi's story we already know. He's the good guy, he's doing this to get the prize money for his sister, yada yada. What we learn about Keith is that he's been in a drunken, depressed haze ever since his loss to Pegasus, leading to excessive drinking, gambling, and in the manga, really high-stakes gambling. Manga Keith also expresses his philosophy that if you're not willing to put everything on the line for any given reason, up to and including your life, then you yourself are worthless. I actually can't tell if this is a completely normal human being thing to say, because on one hand, this is Yu-Gi-Oh! And complete randos with nothing wrong in their lives do tend to have weirdly extreme beliefs like this all the time. But on the other hand, this is Yu-Gi-Oh! And you can't really qualify as a major, or at least reoccurring villain in this franchise, unless something super fucked up has happened to you in your tragic backstory. It's never made clear which case Keith is, and Pegasus says later that Keith had already lost his duelist mind when they had squared off at the beginning of Keith's story. Anime Keith doesn't bore us with hardcore gamer philosophy, he just does everything he can to try to beat Jinochi down, before, during, and even after their duel. When Jinochi wins, Keith points out that Jinochi's final card isn't his, albeit revealing himself in the process. He's then ultimately disqualified, and Pegasus's men attempt to haul him off. What happens to him from here depends. In the anime, he threatens Pegasus with a gun and gets bodied into the ocean. Later, he shows up as one of Malik Ishtar's mind puppets and has to be saved by Yami Bakura of all characters.
In the manga, it's different.
There, he threatens Pegasus with a knife. Honestly, I think the gun was more intimidating. And Pegasus gives him a penalty game. This penalty game leads to him dropping his weapon as his hand changes into a gun, and then Keith is forced to put that gun to his own head and blow his own brains out.
Yeah. Yikes.
Given that this is the version of the story where we know he also plays Russian roulette, it's certainly an appropriate death, on par with a lot of Yami Yugi's shenanigans in Season 0. But judging by the look on this guy's face, I'm guessing he wasn't asked how well versed he was with body disposal at his job interview. And good luck shampooing Keith's brains out of the carpet. That said, Keith's place in the story doesn't end there. A spin-off manga brought our favorite American badass back, where he got to be a much bigger threat than he was before. Quick summary of the premise of R. After Yami Bakura yoinked Pegasus's eye, and Pegasus bled out in the manga continuity, the adopted kids he apparently has discovered his body, and one of them, Yako Tenma, swore vengeance for the death of his master. In pursuit of this, he discovered the Devil Gods, or Wicked Gods as they were translated in English, a trio of XPs to the Phantom/Egyptian gods that are, take a guess, evil. Their power possesses him, and he plots his own filler arc. Keith's role in all this is that, for some reason, Yako decides to test the Devil God's powers of resurrection on him, but not on Pegasus because... I could not tell you. I think the excuse that they never bring up is that A, Pegasus is too powerful to just be brought back that easy. B, Yako really wanted to hurt Yami, so he deliberately took the more complicated way of bringing his master back. And C, we wanted Keith in this plot. Keith is the one to suggest to Yako that Yami was the one who killed Pegasus, though he doesn't actually know since he was already dead by the time it happened. But it's enough to help fuel Yako's revenge plan that he was already working on, and that leads Yako to kidnap Anzu as a vessel for Pegasus's resurrection. Oh, and the Devil Gods are less picky about their duelists than the Phantom Gods, because Yako is allowed to create copies of their cards and give them out to whoever he wants without worrying about them getting zapped. Keith is given a copy of the Devil's Eraser, who is an XP to Osiris. But see, Keith was brought back wrong, though that isn't necessarily the fault of the Devil Gods. See, Keith's actual body was probably a bit smelly by the time Yako found it, and also missing way too much brain, so Keith's resurrection was out of his deck, which is apparently good enough to serve for your resurrection. The line of logic is that a duelist puts their soul into their deck, and that's why it works. Well, the thing is, Jinochi decided to steal one of Keith's cards since Keith had just left his deck sitting out there on the table, so because his deck was incomplete, Keith is now basically a zombie. Given a second chance at life, the first thing Really, the only thing that Keith wants is revenge. Pegasus is already dead, so Keith can't really do anything about that. Instead, he sets his sight on Janochi, though leading up to his duel with him, he does spend a lot of the manga bullying Yugi and Yako's not evil twin brother Gekko, as well as some other randos that were invented for this story. He reveals his part in Yako's rage boner when Janochi finally confronts him, and that encourages Janochi to give Keith the rematch he's been gunning for. By this point in the series, the real-life card game both existed and could be used as basis for their duels in the story itself, now that the cards and the rules were clearly defined. Most of the dueling in R is much more technically accurate, and therefore much more valuable than the duels of Duelist Kingdom. As before, Keith runs a machine deck, and this time his only outlier is the Eraser. The motor archetype he uses allows him to keep tokens on the field after his monsters are destroyed. That allows him to maintain fuel for tribute summons for example, a god card. The most important thing to know about the Eraser's effect is that it's only as powerful as 1,000 times the number of cards your opponent has on the field, which means it's in Keith's interest to make sure Janochi has as many cards on the field as possible. Keith kind of hates the Eraser, for a number of reasons. For one thing, he hates using a card that Yako gave him. Secondly, it doesn't even match the rest of his deck. And thirdly, the fact that it forces him to rely on his opponent for power. Janochi is a reactionary player, as he's always been. Thanks to this, he's able to find an out against the Eraser, once again involving using cards taken from Keith, and defeat it, only to learn about its second effect. When the Eraser is destroyed, it takes everything on the field with it. The Eraser's blood consumes everything, including the duelists. In the dark, both Keith and Janochi lose track of their senses. They can't see anything, can't hear or smell anything. They lose the sensations in their bodies, and Keith describes it as the feeling of death. In this black abyss, Keith acts different. For most of this duel, Keith is somewhere between himself, Pegasus, and Yami Malik of all characters. Now, he's arguably never been a wholly rational person, but it was never in the unhinged sense. He has, until now, always behaved like a lucid, mentally present human being. But in finally getting his post-mortem rematch with Janochi, he's suddenly much more deranged and unlike himself, because this is the only reason he's alive. Not that you can call the state that he's in alive. And he's well aware of this. In the blackness of the Eraser's blood, Janochi realizes that Keith is possessed, just like Tenma is, as Keith is starting to have something of a nervous breakdown. He says aloud the things he fears. He fears being forgotten, disappearing into nothing. He fears the meaninglessness of his own existence, exacerbated by his undead state. And if this is what he's feared all along, that puts just about everything else he's ever done into clear perspective. The Eraser's influence doesn't disappear until the end of the duel a few pages later, but Keith still seems as broken and obsessed as ever. And at this point, Janochi can't even be angry with him. Instead, Janochi offers him mercy, and even a path to forgiveness. If Keith can rediscover why he started dueling to begin with, his duelist's mind, then Janochi will happily duel him again, all he likes. He gives back the time machine card as an olive branch, setting it in Keith's empty hand as Keith, well, either dies or just passes out. We don't know what happens to Keith after the events of R. He's not shown in any of the epilogue panels, and the only other piece of manga canon that was made after this was Dark Side of Dimensions, and Keith's not in that at all. So we never find out if he listened to Janochi, or if he even had the chance to.
And that's all of Keith's important screen time. Now let's actually talk about Keith himself.
Obviously, we're starting the analysis with his character design because look at him. Keith is really the quintessential anime American, in that this is what Japanese folks think Americans look like.
And honestly, they do. Every time I visit the States, I see at least one dude that looks exactly like Keith walking down the street.
Okay, but seriously though, the way he's dressed speaks to more than just his patriotism. There's certainly something bandit-like about him, with the biker vest and the cargo pants and the combat boots and his wristbands. It communicates, even before we see him cheat, that this is a man who doesn't give a damn about the rules. It emphasizes his arrogant, recklessly cruel personality, and the way he's not afraid to play dirty. His bandana and his cross are there for the stereotypical effect, but his sunglasses are a bit of a different story. He wears those things basically 24/7, including in a dark-ass cave, because I guess this man just hates having vision. Actually, he takes them off in Pegasus's castle at night when there's at least light from the moon beaming in to make seeing in the dark possible, but he does not take them off in a cave where there is no light source to speak of. More importantly, they hide his eyes, and while he's certainly expressive regardless, if the eyes are the windows to the soul, then this is a man with the blinds closed as much as possible. It's actually kind of a thing in both versions of the story. When we get to see Keith's eyes, it's usually when his sunglasses have slipped on his face, or when he takes them off. In those moments, he's scheming, or he's deep in thought. In other words, when we're getting a peek into his head. It's much rarer to get to see his eyes through his sunglasses, which happens when he's lost something, is about to, or to quickly draw the audience's attention to Keith's emotional state. The only exception to any of these is when he doesn't have his sunglasses at all as Malik's mind slave, and there, his eyes are for us to see him struggling for control. In fact, his eyes are different in general between the anime and the manga. To be fair, he's just different full stop between the two. Being real for a moment, anime Keith is kind of a hunk, and when I say that, I mean that he's more muscular, and it makes him come off as someone who's strong, even kind of charismatic despite his nasty attitude. Manga Keith, on the other hand, is this kinda weird pointy bitch. Being less pleasant to look at, combined with his personality, makes him feel more creepy and ghoulish. Anime Keith is the guy you get into a fight with at the bar, but Manga Keith is the guy you meet at the end of a dark alleyway. When you get a look at Anime Keith's eyes, he seems more alive than he does in the manga. They're not particularly big and pretty like other characters in the cast, and don't often reflect light in a given shot when we see them. But they sometimes do, particularly when they want to contrast Keith in control of himself against Malik in control of his mind. As for the manga, his eyes are usually drawn with extra lines that make them look discolored and wrong. Half the time, they're outright bloodshot. It emphasizes the degree to which he's not all there, even if it's a storyline where he isn't outright possessed. They're the eyes of a dead man walking, and there's no point in the manga where he looks otherwise. As Pegasus said, he's already lost his duelist's mind by the time we ever meet him. The difference in design and physical depiction really underlines the difference in his core character between the two versions of the story. Anime Keith, for all his nonsense, doesn't seem to have fallen completely. Like, somewhere off screen or in his head, there's still some part of him that's still holding tight to what's left of his integrity as a human being. But Manga Keith is just gone, completely lost to the darkness he's fallen into. He's like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Universe's personal Patrick Bateman. There's an idea of a Keith Howard, but there's no real Keith anymore. What's left is something hollow, empty, a concept that's void of meaning, even to himself, which may go to explain a bit about the character from a greater narrative standpoint.
Let's base the analysis on a very simple question. What is Keith's purpose in this story?
That answer is pretty straightforward in Duelist Kingdom. Bandit Keith is a secondary antagonist purpose-built specifically for Jinochi, a final challenge that stands between him and the money to save his sister's eyes. Keith is intended to be a significant mark in Jinochi's growth as a duelist and as a person, to test his resolve, his strength, and his wits. And to properly accomplish this goal, Keith himself needs to be two things. 1, a foil to Jinochi, and 2, threatening in his own right. For requirement number 1, Keith does properly parallel and contrast Jinochi. They are both luck-based duelists who come from a lower-class environment. Both act outwardly confident and are much cleverer than their typically brute force methods imply. Keith also echoes a lot of Jinochi's attitude in the first chapter of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, before Jinochi became Yugi's friend, belittling and lording their superiority over those they consider weaker than them. Where they differ is where Keith can, from an outside perspective, hold potential leverage over Jinochi, namely in the fact that he is older and more experienced than Jinochi by a whole decade. Utilized properly, Keith should be both academically and tactically Jinochi's better. When he explains his plan for his gang in the manga, it's limited to just gathering enough star chips for himself. But like I said, that doesn't make sense. They already did gather enough star chips for him before he even met Jinochi. At that point, they've already served their purpose. A dimension I think has been left unwritten in this plan is a greater utility for his gang to act as a blockade to prevent anyone else from entering the Duelist Kingdom finals. Including Keith, there are 4 of them. 4 spots in the finals, 4 people dueling in Keith's best interests. Practically speaking, this guarantees Keith's face-off against Pegasus and the capture of the tournament's prize money, since all 3 of these boys rely strictly on Keith to duel. There's even a built-in significance to having someone like Kotsuzuka in particular on his team. Remember, Pegasus didn't defeat Keith himself. He had a kid do it for him. What better way to get back at Pegasus than to use a kid to humiliate him in turn? Keith's degree of experience is something he brings up himself in the manga as well. When he's explaining his all-or-nothing ideology to him, it's something we're left to understand comes from his gambling on games of Russian roulette, if not something that happened to him beforehand. Even if you account for everything that happened to Jinochi in the pre-Duel Monsters manga, all the near-death experience and other traumatizing crap that it comes with apparently living in a version of the world where every peer and authority figure is willing to kill you for something trivial, there's something particularly extreme about Keith's situation in that he actively chose to put himself into it. Jinochi has been forced to put his life on the line, either to escape something bad or to protect someone else, but Keith does what he does for himself. It's an early hint that Keith's a deeply troubled man, one that can be easily missed if you just see him as yet another one of those Yu-Gi-Oh! Antagonists that will sell your soul to Satan for a salted cracker. And granted, even Duelist Kingdom has a lot of those, but the context of Keith's narrative purpose implies there's more to his story than that. After all, Jinochi himself comes from a broken home with an abusive father and a history of gang violence. Who knows what Keith's hiding somewhere in his history?
But what about requirement number 2? Is Keith threatening enough to be an effective final boss for Jinochi? Not really.
This is honestly the most frustrating thing about Keith's story to me. For one reason or another, the choice was made to pretty much never have Keith get the upper hand over Jinochi in any contest between the two. The closest it ever gets is when he traps him in the cave. Right from the point Keith enters the story, we already know Jinochi's the better duelist, because he beat Kotsuzuka. Kotsuzuka wasn't even dueling for himself, he was just a proxy for Keith. It's no different than if Jinochi had dueled Keith himself. And in the lead into the finals, manga Jinochi even gets a chance to beat the shit out of Keith, just so the reader doesn't make the mistake of thinking Keith is in any way a threat to Jinochi before their match. Constantly undercutting Keith's degree of intimidation like this, even knowing that the hero is always supposed to win in kids' fiction, kills the suspension of disbelief that's supposed to allow for tension in the story to build in spite of that. The anime solves this problem a little bit by having Keith block Jinochi's attempts to fight him, thus creating a bit more of an impression that Keith is not someone he'll beat easily. But their duel only has Keith outplaying Jinochi for like 10 minutes before Jinochi spends the rest of the duel absolutely bulldozing him. He's not an obstacle, he's a tripping hazard at best. The whole appeal of Jinochi as a secondary protagonist is that, unlike Yami Yugi, who has to win every duel or else the plot can't continue, Jinochi is in a narrative position where he can subvert expectations. Do you remember the anime's 4th season where Yami actually loses, and how shocking and game-changing that was? Do you remember how much tension it created, to the point where even the next duel with Insector frickin' Haga felt more intense and stressful, even though we know that Yami can't lose a second time or else the anime's over? This story has the benefit of always having that potential plot turn on hand with Jinochi, and we know this because it has happened. Jinochi lost an important duel against Yami Merrick in Battle City. He's also lost his soul in Season 4 against Mai to ramp up the drama leading into the arc's final act. There's a Yugi tuber I watched called TS Anime, and he has a series of videos hypothesizing how important duels across the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise could have ended differently within the rules and limitations of the anime at hand. He's not done a video on Jinochi and Kotsuzuka's duel yet, but let me sum up in 5 seconds how Kotsuzuka could have won. By putting Pumpkin in defense mode, he would have had enough life points to survive the move with shield in right hand, sword in left hand. At that point, he could have easily played, say, Medusa's Ghost, and taken out the last of Jinochi's life points in the next turn and won, proving that Keith's strategies, at least when filtered through another person, whether to his benefit or detriment, are good enough to defeat Jinochi. When you couple this with Jinochi's last loss outside the tournament against Seto Kaiba, it creates real tension around whether or not Jinochi can defeat Keith later when it's just the two of them. And even if the rest of the tournament goes as it should, Jinochi's inevitable victory over Keith feels that much more exciting, and properly demonstrates his growth and his conviction as a duelist in person. As for how Jinochi would stay in the tournament after losing to Kotsuzuka, that's not the point. The point is that because of the way the canonical story plays out, Keith can't fulfill his purpose within it.
But remember, Duelist Kingdom is not the only arc where Keith is important. Let's ask again in the context of Yu-Gi-Oh! R. What is Keith's purpose in this story?
This is a little trickier to work out, because it's not the same purpose he served in Duelist Kingdom. He's not a foil to Jinochi in this story. Jinochi is, by this point, fully realized as a character. He doesn't need a foil to show how much he's grown. If anything, despite Keith's obsession with getting revenge on Jinochi, he doesn't really have much to do with the kid at all. If anything, it seems like R's writer, Akira Ito, wanted to actually focus in on Keith. Keith's behavior and role in R is, from a strictly detached and clinical perspective, superfluous. His main contribution to the story when he's resurrected is to spur Yako onto the vengeance quest he was already on, encouragement Yako himself later says he didn't need in the first place. R itself is about the corrupting nature of vengeance, the way that the cycle is only broken when someone chooses to forgive. Yako is the primary demonstration of this theme, and Keith's story is pretty well a separate example of its own. Keith, like Yako, wants revenge. Unlike Yako, he wants it for his own sake, to the point he says outright that he lives for absolutely nothing else. Where Yako's story creates pathos, a necessity so that the reader is both understanding and supportive of the ultimate choice to forgive, by focusing on his love and mourning for Pegasus, effectively reflecting on his past, Keith accomplishes this by calling attention to the purposelessness of his present. Throughout the second act of R, Keith pretty regularly gets into fights with some of the other card professors. One of them, Richie Merced, manages to beat Keith to the ground, and is only stopped when Yugi, in classic Yugi fashion, defends Keith. Keith's not particularly grateful, but the way Richie is able to pummel him and belittle him as an old washout, Keith's only like 26, bro, what Gen Z shit is this? Makes Keith seem somewhat pitiful. Where in Duelist Kingdom it was a detriment to Keith's role in the story, here it's an advantage. I made a joke just now that Keith's way too young to be past his prime, but actually, now that I think about it, that just adds to how pathetic Ito-san intends for him to be. He's past his prime, and he's only in his mid-20s. At 26, someone like Keith should have only just settled into a career, or finished up their masters at college, or might be raising a toddler. Your life really only begins around 26. Keith, at 26, has just had his career collapse beneath him, and he literally fucking died. That context pulls Keith's weaknesses into sharper focus, but it makes the moments where he's supposed to be threatening counterintuitively more effective. Like I just said, he accomplishes exactly nothing before or during the course of R, unless you count this mostly off-screen victory against Richie. But something about the extremes he's willing to go to, effective or not, to try to counteract his own miserable excuse of an existence, it does a better job of making it feel like Keith could be dangerous if he'd just been given a better opportunity. Making his losing streak into an intentional part of Keith disguises the conventions of a shonen narrative. He's not losing because the good guy has to win. He's losing because he's the unluckiest bastard New York ever spat out. And if he'd just been a little bit more fortunate, he could have done something devastating. Ultimately, Jinochi himself becomes aware of Keith's power and his fragility during their duel. Now, up to this point, Jinochi hasn't really seen Keith as anything more than some asshole. He's never had any reason to think very hard about Keith as a person or his motivations. But under the influence of the eraser, Keith inadvertently tips his hand and shows who he really is. Scared, lost, utterly broken. He's been broken for a long time, but in that moment, in front of the only reason he has to live, there's just nothing left of him. I'm gonna be real here. Jinochi choosing to let go of his anger to actually show compassion for Keith and try to save him is one of the most powerful moments in the entire Duel Monsters series. These pages make me cry without fail, And it's not even just because I love Keith so much, because there is one other character he's lightly compared to. So, we learn about Junichi's shitty, abusive father. All we see of the man is the bottom of his boots, an image Junichi himself recalls and invokes when he's walking up to Duel Keith in Duelist Kingdom. By choosing to offer a hand to a man that makes him think of his father, Junichi just shows what a goddamn sweet kid he is.
Imagine taking out your daddy issues on your card game rival by telling him to go get therapy.
This scene also just invokes so much of what the whole franchise is about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about the way that games help us communicate with one another, the bonds we make across the dueling arena when we play. Junichi, probably even more than Yami or Yugi, has been able to bond with his opponents over the course of the series, and make friends out of enemies. Keith is a pathetic wreck of a person, but he's still a duelist. And even if he's lost the true spirit of dueling, the fact that he still plays means that Junichi still has a way to reach him. All Keith needs to do is take his hand. Given how things ended with Yako, I like to hope that he did.
Can I guess what you guys are thinking? Hey Jay, why did you spend like half an hour rambling at us about some meme antagonist from Baby's first anime? Don't you have something more interesting to spend 80 million years working on videos about? Well, to be honest, this is a birthday present to myself. Bandit Keith's birthday is August 12th, 1 week before mine. And this year, I'm turning 26, the same age as Keith. Around the time I got my hands on the last volume of R, I was hit with some really hard news. And I was just floored for a while. I just sat there not really hearing or seeing anything around me, and my future felt like it didn't exist. I didn't know what I would do with myself. And when something like that happens, even if there are people around you who are supportive of you, who love you, it doesn't really feel like that when you're just alone with those emotions. When you're in the middle of all that dread and self-loathing, it doesn't feel like there's anyone behind you, even if you know they're there. I'm not the kind of person who thinks it's silly in times like that to find comfort in fiction. But I'm sure it's gonna still sound a little silly to you when I say that this meme antagonist from Baby's first anime was the character I clung to. There's something powerful about a story that gives us a character with nothing. No sympathy, no friends, no purpose, no life. And still tells us that that person is valuable. The series is probably never going to follow through on what happens to Keith. He's not Kaiba or Atem or Bakura. There's no gorgeously animated movie out to tell his backstory. Nobody cares about Bandit Keith.
But I care about Bandit Keith. Outside of the sappy stuff, he is consistently an enjoyably awful bastard. And if he's not making me laugh, he's delighting me with his capacity for evil. He's rude, he's ruthless, and he's my man. He makes me happy, and I owe that to his writers, his voice actors, and the friends that indulged my affection for him. Friends that the show wanted me to make. Last month, we went through the loss of beloved franchise creator Kazuki Takahashi. The man was a visionary, an unparalleled creative whose work changed the world. And it's easy to point to the story of Yugi Moto, the pharaoh, and their friends when it comes to the ways in which he did that, but sometimes you're not the destined hero. Sometimes you're down on your luck, beaten, alone, and you still find that light out of the dark.
So, assuming I get this video up on time, arigatou gozaimasu, Takahashi-sensei, Ito-sensei, and happy birthday, Keith. I love you. Okay. One time. I'm Jay on Channel 3, and thanks for dueling. In America.